The November 12 work session of the Williamsburg City Council will come to order. Ms. Felica, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Maslin?
Here.
Ms. Ramsey?
Here.
Mayor Freiling?
Here.
Vice Mayor Pons?
Here.
Mr. Zhang?
Here.
First item on the agenda are items for City Council meeting of November 14th, 2019. Mr. Trivett, do you have anything you'd like to preview for the audience?
We have a pretty busy meeting. We have public hearings to add a definition for a small inn, and that will allow bed and breakfasts to go from 6 rooms to 9 or 10, I believe. We will be looking at an ARB appeal for replacement of windows with vinyl on Lafayette Street, and then we have a public hearing to consider appointments to the school board. Under unfinished business, we'll be considering the updated recommendations for the Tourism Development Grant Review process. We will be considering an ordinance under new business for remedying the blight at 3030 Richmond Road. And we have an EPA brownfield grant for regional site identification and some initial remediation planning. We will consider 2 applications for Tourism Promotion Contingency Fund amounts, one for $10,000 to the Precarious Beer Project and one for $110,000 to Culture Fix. And we'll finish the meeting up with a consideration of the FY19 school year-end spending plan.
Is that it?
Unless you'd like to add more, we can certainly.
Any questions for Mr. Trivett? At this time, we'd like to invite any members of the audience who would like to come before council and speak to any of the items on our Thursday agenda. We'd be happy to hear from you.
I'm Don Pratt. I live at 110 Archer's Hope Drive in Williamsburg, and Bobby just gave me a chocolate, so if I start choking, please forgive me. I'm here to represent the Merchant Square Association of Colonial Williamsburg and to simply request one thing, and that is that the parking garage during the holiday season be made free to visiting guests and locals for free parking.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Brown.
you.
Anybody else like to speak to council? Okay, we'll move on to our background presentations and discussion, the first of which is a presentation concerning the outcomes of the 2019 Williamsburg Live Event as part of the Virginia Arts Festival. Mr. Cross, welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Mayor, members of council, and City Manager. We're here just to kind of give you a little bit of a recap of last year's Williamsburg Live and dive in a little bit into the numbers. So first, we want to thank you for the partnership last year, obviously, with the City of Williamsburg, Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, GWCTA, and all of our other partners. For this year, we went under a major rebranding and changed the format. So we thought we'd kind of let you know where people came from and where we advertised. And then we had a request from staff and council last year to do some research. So we did conduct a back-end research study, so we'll share the results of that with you. So as you know, the dates were June 22 and June 21 and 22 last year. We had on Friday night Parker Millsap opening for Nora Jones, and on Saturday, Mandolin Orange opening for Emmylou Harris. We had over the weekend 6,400 ticket buyers. 4,000 of those were from out of market. 61% of those were outside of Williamsburg. We're really, really happy that we had visitors. We have a fantastic ticketing system with Tessitour, so we're able to track where people come from and how long they stay. So of our ticket buyers, we had ticket buyers from 34 states, including Washington, D.C., and 34 countries. And here's where the out-of-state visitation came from. And we were also asked the interest from the city where in Virginia they were coming from. So we were able to track that by different counties and cities. So it's a pretty good distribution from throughout the entire state. And obviously one of our major goals is to help fill up hotel rooms before we get into July 4th and the busier part of the summer. So this is where we're marketing and how we're breaking it down. Social media becomes a more important part of our marketing every year. But we didn't back off of our print, direct mail advertising, or our radio out of market. From all of our marketing, we were able to track that we had 36 million impressions. And here are some of our print and radio marketing went. And some examples of the coverage. Received really great coverage on both sides of the water and some out of market. And then I'm going to invite Scott to come up. We partnered with Old Dominion University's Research Center to do some after festival interviews with some of our patrons. Scott?
The process of the study was we had people on site basically just asking people for a name and phone number and ask if they'd be willing to participate in a survey, because generally speaking, you won't get solid results. People need to take some time to think about stuff. And then we actually did phone call follow-ups, and we had very good participation, 448 completed interviews. Here's some of the key findings. Just asking people for their opinion of the event on a scale of 1 to 10. We had quality of the concerts at 9, which we felt great about. The overall experience, the food and beverage, and the experience beyond the artists were between 8.5 and 8.7. Those are strong numbers, but we still think that's an area we can make that a better experience as we expand the food and beverage options. I think the most exciting finding there is that 95% of the respondents said they're likely to attend future Williamsburg Live events. That's exactly what we want to see. A couple of the demographics, Rob mentioned more than half of our audience came from out of town, which we feel great about. If you look at the household income, more than half were in the 100,000 and up. We want to price the event so it's available to everyone, but when we draw out of town people from those higher net worth families, they tend to spend more money. They tend to be great tourists. They tend to have the biggest impact. One of the other things that I think surprised us is how many people were a party of 3 or more. So you see 68% was a party of 2. We expect that, but 21% were 3 or more. And when those big parties come again, that's great for our tourism results. Another thing that I think was a pleasant surprise was looking at how many people stayed 2 or more nights. If you combine the stayed 2 nights and the 3 and more nights, that's 63% of our people stayed 2 or more nights. I think we were guessing that was going to be more 1 night, so we were very pleased to see that. You can see where they stayed, primarily hotel, motel, but also a significant number in a bed and breakfast. 93% of our out-of-towners stayed in Williamsburg, which again was a really nice finding from the survey. We saw that 44% attended other museums and attractions while they're in town. The average party spent just over $650, and 93% of them came by car. And finally, Rob mentioned how social media has become more and more important. As we talk to people, one of the interesting things, if you asked, how do you want to hear about future events, 87% said email or social media. So we know that's how, generally speaking, people are wanting to get their information. And we continue to expand our out-of-market advertising. We do very well with social media because it can be so targeted. Finally, we always like to tell you about our education program. That's a very important part of what we do throughout the year. And last year, as has happened for many years, every single 5th grader in Williamsburg, James City County schools took a field trip to a Virginia Arts Festival event, and quite a few more had an artist come into their school. And I think people are very aware you're supporting Williamsburg Live, which is a big, important event, but I also want them to know that you're supporting our work with your students in education. So thank you for that as well. That's it.
Questions, comments?
No real questions. I guess as I look at this, I'm impressed with the new data. I think you really delved into it, and just to find the average spend of the out-of-town visitor, I think is good information, and that they stayed overnight. Clearly not just Williamsburg, but the Williamsburg market. So I think that's positive information. As you look forward, any lessons learned, from this past year going forward to next year? Is there going to be a next year?
Well, there'll definitely be a next year.
Will there be an event next year?
Yes.
So our dates for 2020 are June 26 and 27. So literally, this is the time of year we start diving into artists. It's hard to believe, but a lot of the artists that we would look at are just wrapping up their summer tours, because if they're playing some of the amphitheaters that are in better climates than us, they usually go in through late September and all the way into October. So we're starting to put the inquiries out to artists that we think would make a good fit for the city and for the festival. I think we like the format we went to, where it's a major headliner on each night and an opening act, as opposed to doing all day long on Saturday. We felt it was a better use of our resources and energy, and a better return on investment. I think more people probably went to the restaurants before they went to the concert on the Saturday, since we didn't open the grounds as early. But it didn't really affect our food and beverage on site during the event.
In regards to the artist, is there any information gathering from participants as to what type of music they would like, or is this, how do you determine what artists you should attract?
In the survey, Scott kind of ran the study. Did we?
Yeah, we did ask people, who we'd like to see in the future. We have a running list, but that's really Rob's area for the festival. But we are definitely trying to keep track of a couple things, who they say they want to see, but also looking at the ticket sales of the artists we've had. We now have 4 years of experience here, and starting to see, for example, Norah Jones was a huge hit. I mean, people absolutely loved it. So one of the questions is, who is like Norah Jones, as unique as she is, but who can be an artist like that? Because that was, I think, one of the biggest successes we've ever had up here.
Yeah, so clearly, the caliber of artist, the relevance of an artist makes a big difference in attendance and just desirability for the overall event. So, and I know you guys work on that, and of course, bigger, well-known artists cost more. So there's a balance that you all have to weigh. But thank you for coming back with this information, and look forward to another successful year. I think just in general, what it does to the Williamsburg marketplace is beyond measure. I think putting that vibrancy down there is really something that we all seek to have. So thank you.
I think the only other thing to add is, obviously we have an upcoming concert for the holidays, the Vienna Boys Choir over at Williamsburg. I'm happy to say that's almost sold out. So that was really popular as soon as we put it on sale. So we're finding that's a good pattern for us to do a big holiday event. So this is the 3rd year we've done that. And we're also we've added a second coffee concert this year prior to our Waynesburg weekend. So we find we have a really strong audience for classical music too. So that's, we just announced the rest of the season this past Friday. So we're excited about that. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your presentation. Thank you for being here today, despite, the first time we were seeing snow outside in Williamsburg, which is an unknown occurrence. But congratulations on the rebranding effort. It looks, by all means, through looking these slides and the data that you've provided with us today, that it's been a resounding success. And, despite all the data that we see clearly pointing to the benefit, I think it's also important from the get-go when when Funhouse Fest originated from, just this idea. The most important thing that I think it's taken away, and it continues to this day, is the fact that we've activated a relatively unused area previous to having any of these concerts, and it's opened up to great opportunities such as Summer Breeze concerts and other fascinating ideas that have, no doubt, as the Vice Mayor had mentioned, added to the vibrancy to our downtown. So we'd like to thank you again for partnering with us for so many years. Sorry to miss Bruce Hornsby. We're glad to take him back anytime, but it seems like Williamsburg Live 2019 has done really well without Bruce Hornsby. In terms of this year's data set, I seem to recall that last year you had comparables to the previous year. Is the reason why we don't have any comparable data is because of the rebranding effort?
Yeah, I mean, we're happy to provide that, but we felt it was such a different shift going to the format on Saturday that we knew that we were going to be recalibrating. But we're happy to show the prior years also. We'd be happy to send that along.
Sure. And can you remind the audience and all those who may be tuning in today, how was the $80,000 allocated for that the city provided as grant money. Is it $80,000? I think it's $80,000 to your efforts for Williamsburg Live.
Well, our overall budget for the weekend, is obviously in excess of $500,000, so we're putting it basically towards artist fees and production.
Right, but in terms of the cities, was there any specific
I don't think
allocations?
that
Was it
we're-
social media, or was it just general
I don't
funding?
think it has to be used for the festival, but I don't think it has to go to a certain line item in the festival.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I would just like to thank you again for the presentation, and I agree with what my colleagues have said, that it really activates the space downtown, and it brings in a caliber of musicians that we don't often get to see here. And as much as it's great to have the headliners, it'd be really nice if you could find a sleeper like Rihanna Giddens again. I mean, she's really skyrocketed since she was here a few years ago. And I appreciate the information that you've obtained through the surveys. And were there any comments made during the surveys about, confusion with Fun Fest and then the transition to Williamsburg Live, or questions asked about Bruce Hornsby, or was it just sort of taken in stride as this is the next generation of the festival and everyone was cool with that?
I would say in general, I think it's so much artist-driven and destination of the familiarity with Williamsburg and who's on the roster in Virginia Arts Festival. I think because of, we've been doing this now for 23 years, I think there's a trust level there. So as much as I think, obviously people love it when they see Bruce, I think as long as there's somebody they want to see on the roster, I think they're good. I don't know, within the staff, we weren't getting any pushback or anything. I don't know if specifically in the survey you did or not.
Yeah, I think of the 448 surveys, we probably got about 200 personal comments, but mostly it's about things like parking and the
food
chairs
trucks and
squeaked, or normal type of things and audience experiences. I think generally speaking, there was extreme satisfaction with the artists. I mean, you saw, on a scale of 1 to 10, it was 9, and so I think people felt really good about the artists.
Well, and it was great that Mother Nature
Beautiful days,
cooperated
yeah.
this past summer as opposed to the year before. And I do agree with the change in the format. I went to both nights, and it did allow for people, both locals and for tourists, to do a lot of other things during the day. So, thank you.
I would just think that the thing we always, that we always ask what keeps you up at night. For us, we have that one weekend to make hay, and unlike, a Wolf Trap or a Tanglewood where they've got 12 weeks to program, we've got to be able to find artists that are touring or willing to tour that weekend. And then obviously we've got weather that, we've lucked, as you said, we had a beautiful weekend this past weekend, and that will always affect last minute ticket purchasers. If they're looking Monday, Tuesday out and trying to make that decision, and hey, am I going to run down to Williamsburg for the weekend? And if the forecast isn't good, that's going to affect, I don't think it affects tent sales because people know they're covered, but it definitely will affect lawn seats. So I think, we'll always have those ups and downs driven based on what artists available and how weather affects us. And that's the life you live when you're doing outdoor events.
After the beast.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Of the 4,000 out-of-town buyers, did you get a sense for how many of them were in town just because of this event? That was the prime reason for them being here?
Yeah, I think that's one of the questions we asked, and I think that was around 85% were coming specifically for Williamsburg Live.
And then what about sponsors? What's your track record in terms of were you able to increase the number of sponsors this year?
I think we actually went down just a little bit, and I think that was because I think a lot of people personally knew Bruce and, were sponsoring. So I think one of our challenges, but a challenge we embrace, is how do we expand that corporate support moving forward.
Thank you.
I too appreciate the survey data. I think that's a tremendous help for us. Did you need to incentivize the survey participation at all, or was it just, we're asking for your help? Please answer a question.
We did everyone that completed a survey registered to get 2 tickets for next year's Williamsburg Live, so there was somewhat of an incentive, although it wasn't an enormous one, but we were recommended by the group that did the study that they think it's helpful to do that.
Yeah, from this uninformed perspective, I think that's right. Most people are much more inclined to participate when they feel there's something in it for them. How does attendance, or how did attendance this year compare to what you might view as reasonable capacity? I know it's hard to say with lawn seats, but do you have a sense about what percentage?
It's really interesting because having done a lot of outdoor events, you're always shocked at how many people the area can absorb. I mean, because the difference between Friday and Saturday night, the lawn still felt full, but they just spread out and took more space if there's less people. So, you know, we're pretty confident that if we got to 5,000 people, the space could. We're capping it, and I think that's what we have in our city application is we can do about 1,800 in the tent, and then we could add, 3,200 on the lawn. We've never gotten up that high before, but it'll be interesting to see if we start pushing that, if it becomes uncomfortable.
And it brings its whole other array of challenges, the more people we get coming downtown.
And, we were able to, with the city's help, we were able to push some of the vendors a little further out, which freed up more of the green space this year, which gave people more room. We went a little deeper in the street for the food trucks and merchandise tent and things.
So with the change of format on, I guess it's Saturday, you have a less utilized infrastructure that's there. Are you continuing to think at all about another way to use that during Saturday that's compatible but doesn't, something that brings in another set of audience?
We've talked about it. One of the challenges is we have to change over from Friday to Saturday, and even with just two bands, they both want to tech and sound check. So it's how much time do you have? Either they have to be willing to come in really early to do early sound check, or you're pushing it right up to the gate opening.
Okay. Anything else? Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you for your support.
Our next presentation is concerning the outcomes from the 2019 AVAdventure race by AVAdventure. Welcome, Mr. Stackhouse, Ms. Sykes.
Hi.
Hi, thank you.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, we're here to follow up with a report from this year's Great Williamsburg Adventure Race, which took place on September 29. We got some numbers and some details and some looking forward to talk about. Some quick overview. Tickets, as in past years, Wayne Mary students played for free, thanks to the generous sponsorship of the city, and non-students could come and make a team at individual tickets for $20. Teams themselves had 2 to 4 players on each, and we had 81 pre-registered teams, the vast majority of which were William and Mary student teams. And you can also see there was about half as many community teams and a few that were combo student and community member versions.
Yes, and the William Mary partnership is something we focus on each year. In last year, the event was corresponded with Family Weekend, but we were unable to do that this year because Family Weekend was during Occasion for the Arts. So it was one weekend after William Mary's Family Weekend. And we still partnered with the Office of First Year Experience, and they publicized it to all the students, all their channels. The William Mary Pep Band played for the kickoff, which was new this year. It was very lively and fun. And then we also had some William Mary organizations host challenges during the race in addition to local businesses. And that was the Confucius Institute, Ballroom Dance, the Quidditch team, and the Archery Club.
We have a couple slides of challenge hosts here. The challenges on the adventure race are individual activities that local businesses or organizations host for the most part on their site. So we have players going into their store to complete a challenge. For example, at Three Sisters, there's a tire-related challenge, or at Baskin-Robbins, ice cream-related challenge. And there are, here, let's flip to the next one. And we also incorporated some folks you can see from all over town. So High Street, which we'll talk about more in a second, was a new addition to this year and was probably the most exciting twist we added to the race, being able to bring people into those physical locations. And then you have places like Perfectly Natural Soap, which was too far down Richmond Road to physically allow people to get there in a timely, reasonable response for the race. So instead, they got hosted remotely somewhere on the course, closer to the main area of the race.
In addition to challenge sponsors, we also have prize sponsors, and the prizes go to the top 3 finishing teams. along with trophies and medals for all the glory of finishing the race quickly. And so there is some overlap between challenge hosts and prize sponsors, and then some businesses felt that they couldn't accommodate a challenge, so they only donated a prize and were involved that way. Here are our winning teams, the top 3 teams. We had the family team return from last year. They also were in the top 3 last year. We had several repeating teams, so it was fun to see teams come and compete from year to year.
These are all pictures out from businesses at High Street, as I was getting at before. This was the biggest change from the previous year's race. Working in partnership with the Williamsburg Area Transport Association, we had the trolley tied into the course. So players showing their race bib could get on the trolley for a free ride out to High Street, where they're able to compete inside Orange Theory and Movie Tavern and the Paint on Pottery and Revolution Golf and Grill. There are also remote locations like an archery challenge from the Waymary Archery Club and a dunk tank. And you can see pictured here, Carpets Direct. There are people laying flooring out in the plaza. So it was the most exciting thing we were able to bring to this year's race. We hope to continue to integrate High Street in future races because it added both recognition of these businesses that we were able to get in a really vivid way, but also it was new, and it kind of trained especially the Waymary students. It's like, hey, this thing's a 6-minute trolley ride down the street, and you can go here and check out all these things. So it was a great way to introduce them to the transportation element in addition to the businesses themselves.
So looking ahead, we'd like to continue the event and continue fostering the town-gown relationship through the event. We'd like to partner with the William & Mary Office of Student Leadership Development. President Rowe was on a team this year and was very enthusiastic about the event. And part of the feedback she gave us was that she wished more William & Mary students had participated. And so part of that will be the partnership next year to help reach more students, increase awareness. So in addition to expanding the William & Mary partnership and doing more outreach to students, we'd like to also continue the partnership with WADA and High Street. Several of the High Street businesses had been challenge hosts in past years, but had a remote location, so they were so excited to be able to have people come to their physical location. And as Adam said, we hope to get even more businesses involved next year.
And with that, we'll take any questions related to the event.
Thank you. Appreciate you both being here again. How many years has it been now that we've been doing this?
This was the 5th.
5th year of this race, and as far as like town gown city, it's year 8 or 9 as far as related initiatives.
It seems like the program's evolving, obviously, as it should, you know, finding new outlets. You know, obviously when it started, it was mostly geared towards student involvement, and I think now you're seeing more non-student teams. Have you, obviously you keep track of that. Where are we in terms of number of student participants and a number of non-student participants? Is it one shrinking, one growing, or are they both growing?
It's fairly consistent. The number of overall student teams have outweighed the public teams except for the first year, wherein it was free for everybody and it was a Google form and a lot more of an informal sign-up, in which case we had a lot more community participation in general. Given a lot of the focus has been getting students introduced to local businesses and organizations and physically in those spaces in the community, the city sponsorship allowing us to do that for free and focus on that has slanted it in favor of a lot more of a student participation.
Well, and obviously, as I recall, part of what we wanted to do is to help the students assimilate themselves and understand better what's in the community, where the shops are, and that type of thing. And so I would agree, although I didn't participate, but the assessment of what happened at High Street, and including some of those businesses, makes perfect sense. And but growing the geographic area, I think, would be a burden, you know. So to your point about the business further down Richmond Road, you know, so I think we're heading in the right direction. I like the fact that, you know, students and non-students are participating in this to kind of showcase the Williamsburg marketplace and the Williamsburg community. So
thanks.
Thank you for being here today and reporting the results from, it seems, another successful Great Adventure race. Having been here on this dais hearing the presentations every year, I finally had the opportunity to participate myself. My fiance and her best friend loved this event, and I was I tagged along as a guest. But, I saw firsthand how, what an incredible opportunity for local businesses to gain exposure among students, but also community members who desire to participate in such an event. I was a little worried, given how students, typically, this race took a whole day. It had to take a whole day. And sometimes with students, the challenge is that they don't want to commit for the whole day. But I think the variety of events, and I think with this year having to go to High Street, you had to be able to prepare yourself mentally before signing up for such an event. So I think that helped, and it seemed like most students, stuck it through. It's hard to tell for me, from where I was at, whether students just left, would they go back to study, whatnot. I got to see Andrew Trivet run. You'll never get to see that ever again. That was quite a sight to see. In terms of High Street, I think another thing that was really important was highlighting the value of public transportation, because I believe the rules only stipulate that you could take WADA or some sort, or maybe walk to High Street. No one's going to walk to High Street from Dog Street. I wasn't able to finish all of the events, but based on what I've seen, it seemed to uplift the small businesses in the downtown area. I'd be curious, I don't know if you guys did a survey kind of to what the previous folks over at the Virginia Arts Festival did, whether students or whoever participated were already aware of some of the shops that they had to visit as a result of those events, or maybe which businesses they haven't been to prior to participating in the Great Adventure, because then in that case, that helps the businesses, that helps the exposure, and that's just another piece of evidence towards, bolstering why we need to have such an event for our city. So thank you very much for all you do.
Just to add on that before you go, but maybe consider doing an exit survey.
Right,
as
exit
the Virginia Arts folks did, to kind of get some feedback, might be helpful.
Thank you. And just a couple questions, some spurred from Mr. Zhang's comments. So as far as the student groups participating, since this is really advertised through the first year students, is there any way to know the percentage that were freshmen compared to repeaters? I know when I was over there one year, there were a few teams that came back trying to win the second year, but typically I thought it was mostly for freshmen.
Yes, and that was the genesis of the event, is to partner it with orientation. And so the first few years of the event, it was in August, soon after students arrived, sort of as a welcome event. And then we just, in talking with the city, part of it was just the weather in August. It was very hot to have a 3-hour outdoor race. So that was a consideration in moving it, and then also connecting it to the family weekend and giving an opportunity for the parents to also see some of the local businesses when they're here with their students. So,
Which didn't happen this year.
right, and we don't collect the class year for the students, so we're not sure of the distribution of first year versus upperclassmen.
Or even transfers that
Right.
aren't familiar. And you mentioned 3 hours, so I heard that some teams made it in 2 hours, but some very fast-fleeted team members over here, but I
Some
guess
people sprinted.
2 to 3 hours is sort of the norm for the completion of it.
Yeah, and it depends on the level of intensity of the team.
Right.
So the teams who are truly racing will finish somewhere between an hour and 20 minutes and 2 hours, like in that zone, and then they'll wander off for an hour and come back to hear the final results, and in kind of the downtown area. But then there are other teams, especially those who show up with families or small kids, who kind of want to take it at their own pace and explore as much as they can while the course is open for 3 hours, and then they come back at the last second. So we get both, and I think the 3 hours is a nice balance on kind of accommodating both types of players.
Good. And as far as the number of people you had, looks like 52, 79, about 81 teams. What would you think is sort of maximum capacity for this event?
We're pretty far from hitting it. The capacity for the event could very much expand. The numbers are more open-ended, especially in regards to pre-registration, because we can build the event to accommodate that, and all the organizations that have challenges, if they have a heads up, can work with those many teams. And the challenges themselves can be adjusted to take on more teams. So to put it roughly, there's no real capacity cap unless it's the day of. There were suddenly hundreds of more teams who showed up on the day in such a way that would burden the challenge hosts that weren't expecting double capacity or something.
And I agree about incorporating High Street businesses at High Street. I think that it is a great way for students and community members to become more familiar out there, and also taking WADA. Was there any consideration given, or in the future, to maybe having a shuttle go straight out there? Because I understand this way you had to go through Newtown and sort of the regular route.
We did, yeah. We've asked before, and it's been tricky to set up shuttle delivery with WADA for events like this. One thing that ended up being a benefit by this setup is we told them about the WADA element at the last second right before the race started, and everyone had to quickly do research on their own and look at the schedule and learn what the trolley was and where it went, and it became part of the game itself. We did give them hints, kind of noting the trolley stop right in Merchant Square area, and then the one located behind High Street, where if you got off, you would be right there by the residential area behind High Street, a simple, less than a minute commute to the first challenge in the area, which would save you the whole trip through Newtown. And we hinted at that in the opening, so making it part of the challenge and game, but it ended up making studying the local area transportation schedule part of the actual fun of the event.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think on a capacity question, when I saw you in Merchant Square, you were saying that there was actually a direction that you were giving this year to a lot of the teams. But if you were to go to the shotgun approach, that would really increase the ability to have a lot of teams, right? So they're not overwhelming the merchants at one time.
What do you mean by the direction to the
Didn't you
team?
have them going in one direction initially in terms of the clues?
Oh, at the beginning.
Yeah.
There was a starting challenge that all the teams did at the same time.
Right.
That took them from the community building to Matthew Whaley Elementary School to a point on Duke of Gloucester Street by Bruton. And then from that point, they could go anywhere to the 30 different locations. So it was kind of that. And we haven't had problems with capacity like that in the past, where if we know everybody's going to this outdoor area at Matthew Whaley. So there was no single challenge host or business that everybody was funneled to. Those beginning elements were all our team handling those capacities.
And then what about having more celebrity teams? We had, what, 1.5 celebrity teams? So Benny was on
I don't know if I
one.
consider myself as a
That was the half. Yeah, right. So what about doing more of that, though?
Sure.
Yes, could you rally some celebrities for us?
Sure, yeah.
We're looking at you.
Yeah.
No, I'll designate some. Yeah. And then what about having different segments? So this year we're going to be talking a lot about e-mobility. Why not have an e-mobility segment?
Potentially. Yeah. How would you envision something like that taking shape within the context of the race?
Well, we could partner with maybe somebody we're piloting with in terms of having e-scooters available.
Yeah, something like that would probably be helpful as like an individual specific challenge on the race, where they get to a designated spot and they are able to utilize that and kind of learn about it, as opposed to just descending scooters upon the whole.
Well, maybe an alternate way to get to High Street.
Yeah, that could be.
Yeah, and also maybe partnering with WADA too, because that's something we'll want to be talking about. How do you connect e-scooters to WADA to increase our mobility?
Yeah.
So, okay, thanks.
Did you get any feedback from any of the non-student teams regarding the $20 per person entry fee?
Not this year, because we've had the tickets be part of the event for several years. The first year, there were some complaints saying this was free previously, and now there's a fee. And so we do know that some people didn't return to the event for that reason. But since there has been a charge for tickets for a few years now, we haven't been hearing complaints about it.
One of the reasons I ask is it appears that Mr. Zhang participated as a non-student entrant but avoided the fee. Very clever by calling himself a guest. Even if he was half of a celebrity guest. I can't thank you enough for all the effort that you put into this, the creativity that you bring to the programs, because they're different every year. And I can't imagine how much time and effort goes on in the background to pull it all together. And for the people who did participate, it seemed like, even though it was somewhat warm.
It was
that day,
warm.
we moved it to a little bit later, but it was still pretty toasty outside. It seemed like everybody had a terrific time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Anything else? Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, we have the preview of the updated Tourism Development Grant Review Committee funding recommendations. Ms. DeWitt. And
Thank you.
if I may, before you start, we have a number of things that we'll potentially be discussing here, and I will participate in that discussion, but as an employee of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, I will not discuss any application that may be related to their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. I'm here today to give you an updated Tourism Development Fund grant recommendation, and just to remind everyone where we've been. The City Council amended, well, they appointed a Tourism Development Grant Review Committee last January, amended their policy around Tourism Development Fund in February, and then that there was a phase 1 and a phase 2 applications for the grants. Your committee made its recommendations to you in September, and then in October we learned that one of the applicants had withdrawn, and that was a $2 million project, so that affected the recommendations. So we're back today with a staff recommendation based on the committee's recommendations and based on what's happened in the interim, with an updated recommendation for you. But to go over the purpose of the policy, it's to increase patronage to restaurants, attractions, hotels, and events in the City of Williamsburg through financial assistance and reinvestment in tourism products, placemaking projects, special events, and public-private partnerships. Of note, your change last February was that the regional marketing is handled by the Regional Tourism Council, so that's not part of this policy. That's handled by the Williamsburg Tourism Council. Eligible expenses are listed here, and then some examples of projects are listed actually in your policy. Of note is number 13 says other projects that meet the criteria. So did not want to box ourselves into things we hadn't thought of or things the public sector or the private sector might bring to us. So So there's two changes. Oh, this is the wrong slide. Okay. Well, wrong picture. Just ignore that picture. You can look in your packet. There's a different picture of a parking lot. So as I noted, Goodwin Square was withdrawn by the applicant, Colonial Williamsburg, from consideration, and that was a $400,000 grant that your committee recommended in year 1 through 5 years to equal $2 million. So the two changes that staff's made in this recommendation is to add a grant for downtown parking lot improvements. So in your packet, this should be a picture of a parking lot. So imagine a parking lot there. And that be used to improve downtown parking lots if and when a management and lease agreement is executed between the city and Colonial Williamsburg. So to give you some history here, really the Goodwin Square project proposal started a great conversation and discussion community-wide and between the city and Colonial Williamsburg about parking downtown and some ideas about how to make it more efficient and better. So that process is still underway. So staff is recommending that $750,000 be earmarked out of the Tourism Development Fund to be used to improve the parking lots downtown, like I said, once a management and lease agreement has been executed with the property owner. So I'm totally in the wrong PowerPoint. Bear with me. So Kiwanis Park 4th softball field is the other project that was altered due to the withdrawal of Goodwin Square and the funding. So in order to balance our funding of $2.13 million in this fund, if we add $750,000 for parking lot improvements, remove the $400,000 grant for for Goodwin Square. In order to balance, we needed to tweak the Kiwanis Park 4th softball field. So we had discussions with Parks and Recreation about this, and it's taking about $70,000 out of the first year allocation and moving it to the second year allocation. So its final allocation will be $1.2 million. This will not change the timing of this project. It just changes when the funding's available for that project. And then I'll quickly go through the remaining projects. These recommendations have not changed, but just to remind you, we have Henry Street restrooms, which are owned by Colonial Williamsburg. The committee recommended a $350,000 grant to renovate those restrooms. This would be paid as a reimbursement after Colonial Williamsburg completes the work, and the restrooms must remain open to the general public. We also suggested a deadline for the completion of the end of next calendar year. The Boundary Street Plaza project, the committee recommends that a $100,000 grant be given to the City Parks and Rec Department to purchase a portable stage that will be available for use in the city. So it will be available at this site as proposed in the application, but also available throughout the city. And then a $10,000 grant be appropriated to the Williamsburg Regional Library to continue the furnishing and placemaking of the library that they've done so well out there, of the plaza. Already talked about Kiwanis Park. Prince George Street signage, expansion to a comprehensive wayfinding system for the downtown. The committee's recommending $250,000 grant for a comprehensive wayfinding system from cars trying to park and then getting out of your cars and pedestrians walking through the downtown. So you can have a unified way to find your parking and shopping and dining and other entertainment downtown. And this grant was requested by the Economic Development Authority. The committee's recommending that city staff will manage this project. Quarter Path Recreation Center expansion, an indoor sports facility. This project is a multi-year project. In order to get us to a point where financing would be taken out for the project, we're recommending a $250,000 grant in the first year, to earmark $250,000 in the second year to start building design, $800,000 in the third year to start paying the share of debt service during construction, and then a $1.15 million share out as a bonded debt service, which will need to be matched by other partners in the area. So part of the work this first year is working with other partners on how this works as a regional sports facility that benefits all of us. And here is the spreadsheet, so you can see this all on one page. You see that the estimated appropriation for grants is $2.239 million. We're real close to getting there, and Barbara's sharpening her pencil every month as those dollars come in. Of course, there's no carry forward because this is our first year. And then you see that the grants recommended for awarding are downtown parking, 4th softball field, downtown wayfinding signage, public restroom improvements, furniture and portable stage, and the indoor sports complex, all balancing that to that $2.239 million. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I apologize about the wrong PowerPoint.
Let me just say one thing first. There still seems to be a little bit of confusion within the community, so just for clarification, the funding for these Tourism Development Fund grants is coming from the same general stream that provides the funding for the Tourism Council marketing effort. But this is the city's half of that money that we have the discretion, according to SB 942, to apply any way we would like. And the city's made the commitment to take that half and put it towards tourism-related infrastructure. So this is a model that only exists right now within the city of Williamsburg. James City County and York County, although they have access to, it'll be a different amount of money, but same type of money, they'll choose to use their monies differently. And so the Tourism Development Fund grant is separate from the marketing, and this grant option only exists within the city of Williamsburg. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Questions?
So I know we're going to have more discussion on this Thursday and take action on a Thursday, so I'll be briefer today than I will be maybe Thursday, but maybe not. The Quarter Path Rec Center opportunity, we talk about, there's $250,000 this year, but it's not earmarked for anything. And then in 2021, which would begin, I guess, July 1st of next year, right? That's fiscal year. That'd be for design. How do you see spending that first $250 this year?
So this year is going to be about regional consensus, bringing in our other partners, which includes the 2 counties and also the Tourism Council as well, to discuss this. So that could be used to enhance the study that's already been done, to beef it up, to answer any questions that might be out there. I'm trying to think of other things. To develop a financial model, we need to talk to bond counsel about how bonds will be issued. And
so I think where I was going with that is that I think we ought to consider using some of that money for some artist renditions, some drawings, some designs, so that as we go out to our community partners, we have something tangible to show. And I think that makes a big difference. So I would just not want to reserve FY21 funding for design only, so we spend some of that money
sure.
in advance for design.
And looking at my notes, Councilperson Pons, it says that. So it had just slipped my mind. It says $250,000 for study updates and design work.
Don't we also need to determine exactly where it's going to go?
Yeah.
Right.
Because even though it's listed here as Quarter Path Rec Center expansion indoor sports facility, it could go there or it could go somewhere else, correct?
Exactly. An analysis of sites is another part of that, yes.
So that's all the questions I have, and I look forward to seeing you Thursday.
Thank you, Michelle. I cannot promise anything in terms of being brief or not brief, but I had wanted to start off with a comment, and then I had a couple questions for you. I still recall back when Chairperson Chris Karachi presented to us, and there was an exchange with myself and with Vice Mayor Pons about the metrics, and I just wanted to reiterate the importance of utilizing overnight visitation for any future metrics and to be taken consideration by the committee. I have to be frank, I was disappointed when I heard that he did not acknowledge that as an important factor. But with that moving forward, I think there's a lot of things to be looking forward to. And in terms of the current presentation, with the downtown parking lot improvements, I guess that's slide 3, but I don't know what that is for your presentation. It's the one with Goodwin Square. Can you elaborate a little bit more in terms of the $750,000 grant to be used by the city? So this $750,000 for the purpose of downtown parking is going to be parked in the CIP fund, correct?
So it could be done a number of ways. In fact, I was talking to Finance Director Dameron right before the meeting. It can certainly be go ahead and be transferred to the city CIP. Of course, because it won't be expended until this lease and management agreement are executed. But it can also be held within the Tourism Development Fund and not transferred at all. And because the Tourism Development Fund can serve much as a CIP, where the money can be there for projects that take multiple years. Am I correct, Barbara?
So I wanted to at least address one of the assumptions that was made in the slide, which says after management and lease agreements executed between the city and Colonial Williamsburg. Now, is there, I guess for public consumption, are there ongoing discussions where we have a reasonable expectation that this might happen, that Colonial Williamsburg is at the table with whoever, with Mr. Trivet and yourself discussing about a downtown parking effort? Or are we just parking the money with the hopes of some future?
Sure. Well, I'll say a little bit about that, and then I'll ask Mr. Trivet if he'd like to pitch in. I will say one of the benefits of all the discussions around Goodwin Square, which was a controversial proposal and caused a lot of discussion and rolling up your sleeves and really working together with different partners, including some residents of the city and business owners. More and more talk was happening through that process, and we were getting to a point where we felt there could be a management and lease agreement reached. So I think it's on the horizon, and it's certainly a possibility, but I'll let Mr. Trivet respond.
I think Ms. DeWitt is correct. We put a lot of time and effort into finding what we thought was an acceptable compromise in the P3 discussion. And the product of that was essentially a lease agreement that would enable the city to operate, maintain those existing lots downtown. And it's our hope that Colonial Williamsburg will see that as an opportunity to proceed. It's not exactly the application that they submitted as part of this program, but it's very close. And I think it's definitely to their benefit and certainly to ours as well. It's consistent with the parking study that was done in 2016 in terms of their recommendation. And I am optimistic that we're going to be able to find a way forward and get that lease agreement signed. But I do think that it would be wise for us on Thursday, if the council is so inclined to approve this recommendation, that you put a deadline on it, so that there's an expectation of when this $750,000 that will be held for this project rolls back into the overall fund to be issued to another grant, because we couldn't get that agreement done.
Right. And I think that's a wise suggestion, and obviously staff will include that with the recommendations on Thursday. Just last question, in terms of the Kiwanis Park, transfer to $70,000 or delaying to $70,000 to the next fiscal year. Obviously, $70,000 is not a huge pot of money, but you had stipulated that it's not going to affect the completion date of the project. So I guess that money is just a carryover fund that doesn't really need to be used for, like, advanced, costs or payments or anything like that.
Right. Our fabulous Parks and Recreation staff and the deputy directors here today have looked at that and figured out a way for the project to still move forward on time with that delay of the $70,000.
And that to say, Kiwanis Park, I think all of us on this council believe that it's a priority. So thank you for making that work. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for going through everything, and I would just like to sort of concur with what Mr. Triffitt said about the P3 discussions. It seemed that it created the need for a more holistic approach, not just what was going to happen with P3, but also the other parking lots. And the biggest concern I had, I heard, was about the lack of maintenance in those other parking lots. And when you're talking about this $750,000 going to parking lots, which parking lots, just so everyone is clear, which parking lots are we talking about?
So my understanding is it would be, I may not get the numbers correctly, but the parking lot behind the ticket office on Henry Street, which is P4.
P4.
Maybe I should let you answer. The parking lot behind.
This is more fun.
Pardon?
This is more fun.
This is more fun. The parking lot behind the bookstore.
P2.
P2. And I am not positive about the other two parking lots.
Parking lot behind or in the vicinity of Barrett's, which would be P5. Those are the three in question.
And so I just wanted to have that clarified. And actually, P4 bumps up really to where the bathrooms are. And based on what the thoughts are for the parking lots, I didn't know if there might be some consideration of tying those two together, i.e. would there be any impact on the bathroom project based on what might be occurring in the P4 parking lot? And I do, so I wouldn't mind taking a look at that. And then also, since we would be putting, I think it's a great idea to have a deadline put on the proposal. And since that deadline might be a year, might be 18 months, my preference would be to keep the funds in the TDF and then transfer them to the CIP as opposed to transferring them and then perhaps have to transfer them back. To me, it's a little cleaner keeping them in that original pot.
That makes great sense.
So, thank you.
So when the TDF was developed by the previous city council, there was talks about generational change. Sort of gives the thought that maybe these are going to be game changers in terms of what we're approving. I don't really see that in all of these. How did we sort of transition from that approach?
I can take that one on, Michelle, if you don't mind. I think that when we envisioned this program, we were pretty clear that the first year, maybe even the first 2 years, would be building years. The biggest challenge that we had this year was the proximity with which it all got approved, a process determined, a committee appointed to when the first grant cycle began. And so we didn't have a lot of time to think through how to promote the availability of the money, which I think is a tremendous incentive to that game-changing type of project. I think that this year, Michelle has had some conversations with the committee about how better to advertise the availability. We've talked about venues where those types of ideas are born and how to advertise there. So I think that in the future years, you're going to see that expected game-changing application.
I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that the indoor sports facility is potentially a generational change and a game changer, because if it wasn't for this program, that project would never happen.
I don't think anybody would dispute that.
Okay.
But also being the first year, I think there's also the position you could take is we don't have to use all the money the first year.
Right, that's true.
We seem to be trying to stretch it out, and maybe that's what we shouldn't be doing, because we may have better ideas coming next year that can actually benefit from, the carry forward that we talked about. Also, the downtown parking and CW restrooms, it's like, I'd rather see that as a matching fund, that they would actually have skin in the game, that they would recognize that their responsibility for maintaining the parking lots and put up that money. And the same with the restrooms. Because I'd rather use dollars for restrooms for adding capacity. This doesn't add us any capacity. So why not add a public restroom in the parking structure to help out, the Prince George Street area, get more people comfortable with using the parking structure. So that's what I think would be more helpful. Downtown wayfinding, typically that's a business improvement district finance project where the businesses pay for that themselves. Has there been any talk about that, especially with the Main Street?
Well, there's not been talk about a business improvement district, but I will say historically here, the wayfinding has been handled not by the businesses, but by the city. So the wayfinding that exists and that was part of the 400th commemoration was a public-led effort. So a business improvement district involves adding a tax structure, added taxes to the businesses in a certain area to pay for things like this. So you're correct that in some places that is done. But business improvement districts are not common in Virginia. They're common in other states, but it is one tool that we're allowed to do. So I think it can be done either way. I think certainly the businesses would feel like what they're providing the city and tax revenue and vibrancy, they would argue that it's already there and we're doing it for all areas of the city. And they wouldn't, but I'm just talking in circles now.
Well, I think one thing that is probably important to say is that when the EDA applied for this money, their scope was much more narrow. It was just Prince George Street businesses. And they felt like there was a certain urgency to getting the money and getting this done quickly. When it went to the committee said, we don't want to miss the opportunity to fix wayfinding downtown, which they see as a significant hindrance to business generally. And so they thought this was a venue to try and correct that and at the same time hit the goal of facilitating that visitation downtown.
Because I could see using those funds for enhancing the parking structure, maybe getting more of a promenade from the parking structure to Prince George Street. Maybe use the EDA lights that they wanted to string all over the place, so that everybody knows, how you get there.
You get there.
Make it, more physical than just putting up a lot of signs. In terms of the way we're going to vote on this on Thursday, are we going to vote line item?
I think what we did is, we put a recommended motion on the agenda item summaries, and the one for this item on Thursday splits up what's considered here by the Colonial Williamsburg projects and not Colonial Williamsburg projects, instead of a line item.
But we could choose to.
Oh, yeah, you could do it however you'd like. That's just our suggested path.
Right. Okay, thank you.
I don't have any further questions. Thank you, Ms. DeWitt.
Sure.
Our next presentation discussion is related to direction to staff concerning the regulation of micromobility in the City of Williamsburg.
All right.
Yeah.
Trivet, are you handling this?
I am. Thank you, Mayor. It was fun to think. I have a terrible cold, as you can probably tell, and it was fun to sit in my office today and think, well, if I lose my voice by 4 o'clock, which one of the department heads has to give the cold presentation on micromobility?
I think Chief Dunn.
Chief Dunn, that's a good choice. I think that's good. So micromobility in Williamsburg, this is something that we wanted to talk about and try to give you some context of it. What is micromobility? There are a lot of terms used for this now, and essentially it is a small vehicle that's usually powered with an electric motor, generally for one person to ride. And I put some pictures here of examples. Obviously, everybody knows the electric scooters, and then a lesser-known example from San Francisco of pogo sticks.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the reasons that we're talking about this is because they're becoming more and more prevalent. Micromobility has become much more affordable. This is just an example of how affordable it's become and how open-ended the platform is. These are examples of devices by Segway, who now offers 12 models of vehicles in the micromobility range that go from anywhere. In fact, this says $429, but I think the other night when I was looking, I could find a Segway e-scooter that was around $300. And they can have speeds of 25 miles an hour and up to 40 miles in range. So certainly a viable option for people looking for an alternative to driving their car. So we want to start with outlining the different ways you can use micromobility. Personal use, obviously. If you've driven around Williamsburg lately, you've seen some of these devices already at play. I'm sort of amazed at how many electric skateboards I see in use in the city. Right now, they definitely outnumber the scooters. I've seen a lot of the one-wheel devices that were shown there on that last page. So this is something that's catching on. And fortunately, I guess it's good and bad that the statute gives us, that the Virginia Code gives us a pretty decent outline of what the rules are for use of this platform in the street and on the sidewalk. As you can see there, there's a collage of code sections, and that is every section of state code that deals with this in terms of bicycles or scooters or skateboards. And then I just pulled out 17 different guides or instructions on how to use and what to use and where to use these types of devices. But it's important to point out that when we move through this presentation today, we're going to be talking about shared use mobility, shared use of micromobility. And the reason we're talking about it, it's important to note, is that the state statutes were changed during the General Assembly this past year to allow us the authority to regulate this as a use inside the jurisdiction. But it also came with sort of an interesting twist at the end, and that is if the locality does not take action to regulate the use by January the 1st, then there are no rules. It doesn't mean that you couldn't come back later and adopt rules, but on January the 1st, if you don't have rules in place, then vendors of shared use micromobility could deploy their devices in the city without constraint. And so we thought it was important for the City Council to at least have this discussion so that we're prepared on January the 1st with some type of regulation. So one of the questions that often comes up is, well, is this a fad? And so I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I did pull some information off of the internet regarding the businesses that sort of govern micromobility, particularly e-scooters. And what's interesting to me is the rate of adoption of e-scooters over other forms of mobility in sort of this sector. So if you think about e-bikes, but even before that, the bike share, e-scooters have been adopted almost 3 to 1 in communities that have both. And it's sort of interesting, a group of us from the city attended the National Planning Conference this year, and there was a session on this topic, and they opened the session with, how many of you remember the old technology of bike share? And so it sort of immediately set the tone of, if you're still working on a bike share program, you're too late, you need to start working on this instead, because it's obviously the preferred mode of moving around. All right, so what are our options in terms of regulation? And I put together this little slide that shows you what the choices are. The first option there on the left is the option to contract with a vendor. And then the next option would be to have open policy, meaning that you can come and deploy your scooters or your micromobility devices without restriction. Another option would be to ban them outright, so we're not going to allow these shared programs. And then the last option would be permit. The easy question is, what's the difference between a permit system and a contract system? Well, in a permit system, what you do is you establish sort of general rules and regulations that if a company can satisfy, they would receive a permit. You might even include a cap on the number of devices. So as long as that cap's not been reached and a new company applies, you would issue the permit and they could deploy their devices. The contract option is much more restrictive in terms of giving the locality control over the program, because you're actually selecting a vendor or vendors to come in and supply this new use at your authorization. So you get to sort of control how that happens in a much grander way. So then as we start to consider what we should do, obviously the easy thing for us to do is to turn to other cities that have already done it. And we're fortunate because here in Virginia there are a lot of cities that have already taken this on, some for as long as a year or more. But also on the West Coast, we can find numerous examples of cities that have been dealing with the micromobility issue for a lot longer than any of the Virginia localities. And so the advantage is we can sort of learn from their example. So I put together some of the statistics that are available concerning these programs. I did talk to a few of the managers of the programs in these cities, but not all of them. So Alexandria has published a pretty extensive report on the usage of their pilot program, which is permit-based. They currently have 7 vendors. They have a pretty hefty permit fee for the vendors of $5,000. But you can see there, it's a widely used service for Alexandria. And the thing that's interesting about their data is they did an excellent job of reporting sort of at the end of this list. You can see some of the community impacts that people are worried about. Parking issues reported, other issues reported, the number of units that the locality had to tow because they were in the wrong place or obstructing traffic, and then the number of citations issued by the police department. The last two I think are interesting because one of the things that Alexandria did was sort of similar to what we're trying to do with our ambassadors in parking, is they asked their police department to be proactive in the education role. So if you see someone using a scooter incorrectly or parking it incorrectly, instead of initially issuing that citation, educate them on what needs to be done. And so they've documented that there were 138 stops for education by the police department. And then the last bullet is really interesting, and that is the 13 corrals. So in this case, corral means simply an area of the street or a parking lot that is painted and designated for scooter parking. If you think about some places you've been where there's dedicated motorcycle parking, very similar to that in concept. So moving on to Charlottesville, it's another permit-based pilot program. They currently have 2 vendors. They had 3 and have lost 1. Their pilot program closes at the end of December, so they're getting close to the end. They have a $500 permit fee and also charge a per unit per day fee of $1. And that money goes to operating the program, but also helping them build out their bike lane and pedestrian infrastructure. And again, I just collected some data there from their program. They have published a midterm report. What's interesting is that most of these cities that have had a program, a pilot program, have at some point already come back to their city councils and said, here's what's not working and here's what we can do to fix it, and have adjusted their program accordingly. And so we're really at a great advantage now that we can learn from those examples and not make those same mistakes. Again, here you can see Charlottesville's using a corral program. They have 10 in use in the city. And on the whole, the administrator thought the program was going pretty well.
Let me ask you a question about that. Maybe I'm reading this incorrectly. When it says units deployed, that's the number of scooters or e-mobility devices, correct?
That's right.
So Charlottesville had 150 units deployed. Alexandria had between 650 and 700 units deployed. Mm-hmm. But Charlottesville had twice as many trips.
Well, so Charlottesville, and you're right, it's a little misleading. That 150 units deployed is per vendor.
Okay.
So that's a cap per vendor. She could not give me the number of units currently in use.
But even so, it's still significantly less
Yes.
than Alexandria, but they're generating so many more trips.
And I think it's just about, the adoption rate. Obviously, Charlottesville has a large university, and I think that's a primary user, but also they have the very young demographic of resident, and they've adopted it pretty well also. So in Norfolk, they have launched a pilot back in June. It's RFP based, and they have one vendor now. I spoke to the administrator of the Norfolk program, and he really couldn't say enough good things about how well it was going. He thinks that it's just been really flawless in terms of adaptation. He said that a lot of the negative things that they were worried about, such as parking violations and injuries, the longer the program runs, the less and less that becomes an issue, and primarily because they are holding the company responsible for violations of parking requirement. And so that's really caused a partnership to exist between the vendor and the city in terms of correcting that early and often. In Virginia Beach, they've had an open program for over a year. If you've been paying attention to the news, they're starting to tighten that up now. They recently banned them in the oceanfront area while they work on regulations. I think they have even restricted them for use at night. So they're starting to realize that an open permit program may not be the best solution. And of course, they have a pretty high permit fee. There you can see $10,000 if you're including the oceanfront, $5,000 if you're not. There's $100 per unit, and then a per unit daily fee of half a dollar. So an interesting way to generate some revenue to help run the program, but also help improve the facilities that make this easier to do. And then I wanted to turn to Oakland and Santa Monica because they have been doing this for a long time. So if you really want to look at how it's going and early adoption users, we can learn a lot from their programs. So Oakland, California, they began their process in April of 2018. They issued their first permit in July. They currently have 4 operators that are deploying devices in the city now. They do a low income discount, which I thought was interesting, and then a very high permit fees and usage fees. And then I just included some of the data that's available concerning their program. And then Santa Monica, California, which really I think is our best example, primarily because they have been dealing with this issue for a very long time and have been running a pilot program really since its inception. What's interesting about Santa Monica is that they just published their report on how the pilot program has gone about 6 days ago. So very fresh data in terms of how it's gone and what they should do differently and what they're planning to change about their program. So good data there, lots of good information. I can certainly provide that report to you if you'd like to see it. I enjoyed reading it and sort of extracting from these localities that I've just talked about the best practices that we should consider for a program that we might deploy here in Williamsburg. Obviously, a question that comes up is what is the county going to do and how will this relate to William & Mary? We have been working with both of those entities on how to handle this issue. James City County has considered or will be considering, I can never keep straight their meeting date, what to do about e-mobility. They have decided what they proposed that the board act on is a permit system. A $250 fee. It's a very simple type of approach. I think that the county recognizes that if a vendor deploys units in this area, they will be deployed inside the city first, and there'll be some connectivity to the county. And so they're going to rely on us to regulate that more thoroughly. And then William & Mary, we have been working with them for quite some time now on this topic in the hopes that whatever we decide to do can be matched, supported, and partnered with on campus. Because it will be very difficult for them to have a policy that doesn't match ours in terms of rules and regulations, and it would be much more simple if we were all working with the same vendor that might be involved. So what are the lessons learned that you can pull out of those communities that have already done this? These are just 6 of the main topics: safety, speed, what to do with the data that's collected and who has rights to it, parking, where can they park and how can they be kept from obstructing the sidewalks, locations for use, and then liability. So who's responsible when there is an injury. So the staff recommendation would be that you consider a pilot program and that we do an RFP searching for one vendor. We think that'll give us the best opportunity to sort of test out the plan and make sure that we are equipped to manage that relationship with the vendor so that we can provide this service to the community with the least amount of impact, negative impact. We would propose that the pilot program be for a period of 3 years, which would give us ample time to sort of run the program and adjust it based on Williamsburg's very specific needs. So key elements of what we might include in a pilot program, and I just arranged these first 6 based after those sort of key issues that were observed in the other pilot programs that have been in use for some time. Under safety, what we found is that a lot of vendors are willing to do and advocate for sort of rider workshops where they can help people understand how best to use their products. Obviously, it's to their advantage and ours if the riders are educated and able to avoid injury and also avoid damaging the devices. The longer that they're on the street, the more likely it is that the company can make a profit off the unit. So in this case, what we're suggesting is that we do 4 rider academies each year, and we would time 2 of those with the beginning of the semesters at William & Mary. So I think that would go a long way in terms of educating folks on how to use these new devices on the street. The second issue is parking, and this is the one really that probably gets the most attention because it's the one that people pay the most attention to. And it's really, if you're not using the scooter, this is where you're going to be impacted by them, is having to deal with them on the sidewalks, having to deal with them parked somewhere that you don't find convenient. One of the ways that we can deal with that is we can ask the vendor that is successful in this process to deploy a docking station that uses solar to charge the units. So hopefully that's a twofold benefit. Benefit to us because we can sort of organize the chaos of scooters in certain areas, and also because it can reduce the amount of time that they have to spend retrieving units to charge them and then redeploy them. So what we would be doing is looking at key locations where we might put a solar docking station and then asking the vendor to make it so that when you go to end your ride using your smartphone on the scooter, it won't let you end or terminate that ride until you've parked it in the solar station, if you're in a zone that has one.
The scooter just keeps going.
Yeah, otherwise you're still paying for it every minute and until you find the right place to put it. And of course, if you've used these scooters and the apps associated with them, it's very easy and convenient. It's very clear as to where you can find units that are not in use and then also where you can park them. Next is speed, and I just matched what most localities have done in terms of limiting speed, and they have reduced it from the capability of the scooter, which is typically around 20 miles per hour to 15. In some places, they have enacted speed zones where it slows it down even further than that. So if you've got an area where you've got really high pedestrian traffic and you want to try and avoid those collisions, you could reduce it even further. So that's a topic for discussion. Locations where we can use these, obviously there are ways to restrict the use of the scooter. The app has the ability to geofence locations, meaning that you can use the scooter until you hit that boundary and then the scooter stops using and the app tells you you're exiting the zone, you need to return it. And so that's a way to sort of limit scooters from going places you don't want them to go. And obviously the areas that we've talked about already include the historic area. I think as we think about the historic area, I don't mean to imply the zoning historic area, but more sort of the museum space proper. So areas where cars are not allowed today, we would continue to try and restrict e-scooters from being used down there. And then the data. The data is important because the vendor is collecting a tremendous amount of information every time somebody logs in, uses the app, and rides the scooter. And for the localities in question, that data is critical in terms of evaluating the effectiveness of your pilot program, but also adjusting it when it needs to be adjusted. And so when we craft an agreement with the vendor, we'll need to be very careful about what data is shared and on what frequency. And of course, we'll be very careful to maintain the confidentiality of the user data. And then the last one is liability. This is one, obviously, it should be a concern if someone gets hurt, who is responsible. We can deal with that to a degree by asking the vendor to include a waiver that you have to sign off on before you can engage the scooter. And so we would indemnify the city to the extent that we can using that process. Next is fees. Obviously, to administer this program, despite the fact that we would be doing an RFP and selecting one vendor, there will be people involved in monitoring the use and determining whether or not the pilot program has been successful and what we need to change if we do. And so what we'd like to see is a licensure fee. We've not put a number on that yet. And also include the per vehicle per day fee. And the benefit of that would be that it could go toward the enforcement costs associated with illegal parking and other types of violations of the code. And then the last fee that I envision would be a fee per use that would go toward improving our bike and pedestrian facilities, which again, I think is going to become more and more important as we see this type of technology adopted in the city. Affordability, as I said, I do like the idea of a low-income program, and I think there are good examples in some of these cities that are using it. Santa Monica has a pretty tested and valued program. They're not widely used, but I think having the benefit there is important. And so I would be interested in seeing us try and craft a low-income benefit. Number 9 would be support, and that is that we want to make sure that there are people on hand to address the issues that get reported, because there will be issues reported. All you have to do is look back at those localities and their data to see how many calls they received that require action. And so we want to make sure that it's not just city staff that's correcting those, that there are vendor representatives in Greater Williamsburg with a facility to maintain and redistribute those when that happens. Number 10, numbers. How many units can we use in Williamsburg? It's hard to say. I think that the industry sort of looks at 1 scooter per 100 residents. And so if you sort of look at it that way, we're in the neighborhood of 150. My suggestion is that we start with a smaller number than that sort of industry recommendation and allow it to move up as the units are used. So I've proposed here a dynamic cap adjustment, again, based on what Santa Monica has done in terms of the number of riders or the number of rides on average per device. And so if a threshold is exceeded, I think here I've put 3, then we would consider increasing the number of devices allowed to be deployed by the vendor. And then number 11 is a partnership. I want to be very clear that as we move into a pilot program, we're looking for a partner, not just a contractor, to help us sculpt a program that benefits the community and is used. And I think that's to their benefit also. And then the last item, as I said, is the duration. We envision 3 years for the program, and then the option for either party to terminate the pilot program within 30 days, with 30 days notice. So what are the next steps? In December, we'll bring this back to you with a sort of completed outline of the pilot program and its parameters based on our conversation here today. And then in February, we would draft and issue the RFP, hopefully make a selection in March, and see units deployed in May. That, we'll take any questions and get your feedback.
Thank you, Mr. Trivett. Very comprehensive review of what's out there, kind of best practices, and I think you certainly covered a lot of the issues. For me, it's beginning with, do you ban them or not? I just don't think banning is a good solution. Particularly with the young population at the college, and I think the college is going to have some sort of program. So if we can create a program in conjunction with the college, I think benefits everybody, as you pointed out. And then it's safety, I think, is a big issue. Safety for the user of the ride, the apparatus, safety of pedestrians on the roadway, parking sidewalks, and then motorists. And so how do you balance that out? And so I think you've kind of addressed some of that, talking about speed limits, speed zones. One of the concerns I have, and I haven't figured it out, but for myself is, do you allow them on sidewalks? I think that's a critical question, and one that I think would be good to get some feedback from the community, because I can see that there's a place for them on sidewalks, because there are some roadways that make sense not to be on the roadway, and so I think that has to be part of the thinking as we move forward to kind of figure out how that works out. The type of unit, I think, is important, although I really like the go-kart looking one. I'm thinking of getting one myself. It goes up to about 45. But that puts the rider low on the ground, and so it makes it harder for motorists to see them, and so that's a concern. So I like the more upright ones, the scooter, maybe the single, I don't know, skateboard, single wheel. But I think we got to grapple with, how many different types of units do we deploy? And so I'd be interested in that kind of feedback. Docking stations, where they go, I like your suggestion. As the rider has to drop it off somewhere rather than just on the sidewalk, in the middle of nowhere. Otherwise, the fee continues. I see that might cause some limitations in usage, but I think, in working with the college, maybe there's a real viable solution to provide more than just a few docking stations. Because we certainly don't want them piled up in front of Talbot's, for example. But access to the train station, around campus, I think, there's lots of places that make sense, and so we've got to figure that out. Fees, there is an expense to it. We're going to have to monitor it, so I think there has to be a way for us to recoup some of those costs. But in general, I think it's the new reality. I think this is where people are going to be. We'll be seeing more and more of them. I saw 2 students on a skateboard yesterday for the first time, which is, I think, illegal. But we need to.
Did you stop and educate?
Yeah, did you stop them?
They were going too fast for me to catch them. So I think we're heading in the right directions. I think you've touched on a lot of the things that I'm concerned about, and so I added those few points. But look forward to seeing what that draft proposal looks like next month.
Thank you for your comprehensive presentation, Mr. Trivett. I think you struck a chord when you mentioned that this was a very intriguing topic, and very much so. It's definitely garnered a lot of conversation about how it could provide an alternative for public transportation. It could provide a means of promoting tourism. All these things are very relevant towards our community. Nevertheless, with the other localities that we've done as comparisons for this presentation. I think there are also other situations that we've seen with other localities, whether they have, to the extent they've regulated or not regulated, that gives me pause. The dockless system makes me a little nervous. I specifically recall participating in a meeting. This has been subject to meeting with local government associations on the Virginia Municipal League. The Harrisonburg City mayor found herself in a situation where a bunch of angry students tossed a bunch of dockless scooters in her front yard. And that led her and her city council to pursue some sort of regulation, tightening that up. But I think, based on your presentation, we're at a good place. And I think I had a couple questions to follow up along with those comments. In terms of the first one, I noticed that in one of the slides, there are a lot of slides here, that under the regulations from the General Assembly, that folks who use these micromobilities are considered pedestrians and not drivers. So if Doug buys one of those little low ground vehicles and going 45, if it can go 45, would he still be considered a pedestrian for those purposes?
When they're in a crosswalk or on a sidewalk.
Just for a
It
sidewalk,
depends on where
but
they
still.
are.
And the statute also, the Virginia code right now is very specific about the types of devices that are included in this definition, and it doesn't include the go-kart. Sorry, Vice Mayor.
So I'd have to own one personally.
That's right.
Right, because if it were a pedestrian versus a driver, there are different liabilities, criminal liability with that. With motorists, you could be subject to operating while intoxicated charge, right?
Right, so it matters where you are operating it. If you're operating it on a sidewalk, you're considered a pedestrian, but if you're operating one of these on the road, then it can be treated as a motor vehicle. So it's not technically a motor vehicle unless you're operating it on a road.
So in terms of some of the enforcement actions that we've seen from the localities you provided, have those enforcement actions been, I guess, for users of micromobility on sidewalks, so therefore considered pedestrians, for the ones in Virginia at least? I know you included California examples. Were those drunken public charges? I mean, for those that involved some criminal
Pursuant to the administrators that I talked to, the vast majority of those citations were parking violations.
Okay. So a lot of it's just parking. In terms of the city's liability, I saw that you wanted to include a waiver. I think that's really important, and I think it's wise that we pursue such action. In terms of our sovereign immunity, I don't think tort actions against the city can only be up to a certain extent. So how much does this waiver actually abscond us of liability?
Well, it's not a governmental function operating
Right.
these. I mean, we have liability for sidewalk-related injuries.
Right.
We're not counties, so we don't have the same caps on liability that counties have, who get to take advantage of that. There are some things that the city can do to protect themselves. One is to be indemnified by the company operating these. One is to have someone sign a waiver that if they're injured on these, they're assuming the risk of riding one of these. And so those would be things that we would pursue to try to prevent that. But at the end of the day, you can't stop someone from suing you if they want to sue you. And so we'll have our share of claims associated with these. That would be related to defects in the sidewalk, for example, that cause someone to wreck the scooter. And that's one of the issues that jurisdictions that are adopting these are having to assume.
Sure. And I think with this pilot program, it brings to head a great opportunity to discuss, I think in terms of the positives, the benefits that this regulation can tout is that as some of the localities we've seen with these examples, they've contributed some of the permit fees and the revenue towards investing in their infrastructure or complete streets. And I think we have an opportunity to do that as well. For a number of years, we wanted to complete out our streets throughout the city, adding bike lanes, expanding sidewalks. I think this is no different. And if we consider any regulation, I think you know this, but I would like us to at least find some ways to explore what the partnership can do to help us with those investments on that infrastructure, because the city does own its streets. We do have to maintain them, and I know we get our fair share of VDOT funding to help maintain it, but this could be another opportunity for that funding. York County, is there any, I guess it's maybe further out where this micromobility doesn't really matter in terms of York County lines, but have you thought of?
I haven't asked York County what they're planning to do, so I can't answer that.
Final question, how will this policy address folks who own their own units already?
Doesn't.
It does not?
No, that'd be personal use. It's not covered by this. They're governed by the state statute.
Okay. Understood. Thank you.
And before we
ahead.
continue with the questions, I should have pointed out, we do have a representative from SPIN here tonight. So if you had a question for a vendor or about the industry, I think you'd be an excellent source.
Thank you.
And it looks like he's actually brought a scooter, so the council can try it out.
I think it's illegally parked, though.
Thank you. I don't have too many questions or comments. I think that you gave a very thorough presentation, and my colleagues have asked a lot of the same questions that I had to mind. And also Vice Mayor Pond's comment about that, we need to take this into consideration and move forward. This is one of the current trends, and who knows what's next, but I don't think we can be ostriches in the sand and pretend it's not around us and happening. The other thing I noticed that Norfolk did an RFP-based pilot program, and you had on here one vendor now. Is it their plan to increase that, or?
He did not say. I think that they might look to increase it based on the success of the program.
For our size of city, and of course there's no other city that's around our size listed here, and we know how unique and special we are. So I think one is probably adequate. And just questioning parking, we spend so much time talking about that. There's a difference between corrals and docking.
Yes.
And just
And at least in my mind, there is. A corral is simply just a marked area of the pavement that you can sit your scooter when you're done with it, versus a docking station, which would be much more formal and a place where you have to connect it or hook it up.
And there would be fewer of those, I assume.
Yes.
And then there would just be, leave the scooter where I am, wherever that might be.
And I think that, we should recognize that the advantage of this technology is being able to pick it up where you're at and take it to where you need to go. And if you're too limiting in how that occurs, then you're defeating the whole purpose. If you look at the data from these localities in terms of their pilot programs, one of the things that they observed is that it is supplying that first mile, last mile connection to mass transit. And so by being overly restrictive in where you can leave it, and then, of course, the converse of that is where you can pick it up, then you're defeating that use.
And I guess it just sort of all works out. I mean, if you're talking about first mile, last mile, and someone gets off the bus and hopes that there's a scooter there that they can pick up for that last mile home, it's just, that's what it is, a hope. There's no guarantee that there might be the same one that they left that morning sitting there waiting for them when they come back.
Of course, you use the app to know where they are. So, if you rode the bus to the transportation center and the docking station that's there is empty, you pull up the app and see where the nearest one is that's not in use.
Okay. And then we talked about that too, that there are likely to be opportunities for people to find that information out if they do not have an app-based phone.
Yeah, a lot of the vendors have an alternative to using a smartphone. I've never used that, so I don't know how that functions, but I know that they do have alternatives.
But I applaud you for taking a lot of key elements into consideration. So thank you.
Yeah, I think I was back at the University of Virginia in September, and a couple blocks adjacent to it in Charlottesville called The Corner. It's got about some of the most downtown vibrancy you'll ever see, and it was every mode of transportation except for maybe horseback that day. And so I think this could actually be jump-starting our vibrancy, downtown vibrancy, and also I think it's a good way, we talk about linking different areas. This is a great way to link different areas.
Like Midtown?
Yeah, Midtown, High Street. And I think from a public policy standpoint, it's a great way to enhance workforce mobility, as we said, the first mile and the last mile, partnering with WADA, not only having the docking stations at each end, looking at where people are coming from, where they're going to in terms of employment, and I know WADA is going to be looking at, are they allowed on the bus? Because it certainly may be easier to bring them on the bus than putting your bike on the front of the bus. So they're going to be looking at those issues. Also, it's great to partner with the college, because I think that's where a lot of the users are going to be coming from, and look at circulation patterns. I think we can do that in concert with the partner there. For example, one of the transportation issues that the college has is how do we get more students who don't have cars out to baseball, soccer, and lacrosse fields. And this would be a great way to do it, but sort of looking at, okay, which areas do you go on the road that are 25 miles an hour or less? And then when you're on Trayborn, now you got to jump to the sidewalk because that's maybe 30 miles an hour. We may be looking at, maybe we're redoing some of the roads because of that type of circulation. Also for street maintenance. So it's a lot easier for a bike to be riding on the right-hand side of the road towards the curb in some of our bike paths with the larger tires than some of these e-scooters. So I think we're going to be spending more money in terms of keeping those areas clean of debris than we are doing now. And one question on we've been talking a lot about crosswalk safety for pedestrians, and seeing that this is considered a pedestrian in the crosswalk. Does the technology allow us to, and maybe this is a question for our potential partner, does the technology allow us to slow down the scooter when it knows it's in a crosswalk so it's going at a pedestrian rate?
Would you mind coming to the podium to answer the question, please?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor and members of the Williamsburg City Council. My name is Will Burns. I'm the Director of Government Partnerships for SPIN for the East Coast, and SPIN is owned by Ford Motor Company. To answer your question, you're referring to geofencing. which is how we're able to tell our scooters, we know where our scooters are and how we're able to tell them what to do. We use commercial GPS, which is not as accurate as military-grade GPS, so it's within so many feet as opposed to inches. So what we can do is geofence an area, let's say a street, and say that a scooter, that would be a no-ride zone or a no-park zone. It's much more difficult to make the scooter understand the difference between the street and the sidewalk because the GPS is just not that granular yet.
But let's say we geofence a part of maybe the historic college area. Can it reduce the speed limit, put a governor on there for the speed?
Absolutely. We do slow ride zones for cities and campuses at their request. The one thing that you would want to make sure of is that it's a large enough area, and that you'd also want to make sure that riders understood. We would educate them that, like, if you come into this area, the scooter is going to slow down because you're in a slow ride zone.
They don't think their battery's going dead.
Right. Well, or that the scooter doesn't work.
So, okay, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So with Airbnb, there was, maybe not directly to us, but we saw with other localities, there was a message sent that banning any kind of short-term rental was not going to be an acceptable policy from the General Assembly. That is not the case with this, that if a community wants to ban the e-mobility devices, the shared version, they can?
Yeah, all I can say is I'm not aware of that mentality. The patron of the bill was from Southwest Virginia, and I think he genuinely wanted to try and just give localities the opportunity to regulate. That being said, if every locality in the Commonwealth adopted a ban, it wouldn't surprise me if we see a revised bill being introduced during the session. But I think that there are localities that have at least implemented temporary bans while they get their regulations in place. So I think banning is on the table. And for some localities, maybe that's the right path.
The state legislation specifically addresses the possibility of a pilot program.
Yes.
But it doesn't say anything relevant to permitting versus licensing.
No.
Is that granted to us through some other?
I think that's inherent in what you have the authority to do. So there's no business use of city streets without city council granting a franchise or a license. And so Drew and I have talked about that, and probably the form that you will be seeing from this is a license, and that's why it's the ordinance, the draft ordinance is currently written the way that it is.
And even if we adopt a pilot program and we create this RFP and we put it out there, there's no guarantee that any vendor is going to respond in the manner that we would expect.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up because, while we are looking at best practices from communities all over the country, we have taken the ones we think fit our need, but as we go and try to enter the market and connect with a vendor to supply that, we may find that it's just too onerous in one way or another, particularly the fees. And if that were to happen, I would need to come back to City Council and report that and ask for direction. Do you want us to reduce our expectation or hold fast to the requirement and just not have a vendor?
And then if we decided at that point to change some of the requirements that met the most objection in the marketplace, we would have to issue a new RFP and go through the process all over again.
Potentially, just depends on where we are in that process.
I mean, it wouldn't seem quite right to just work then with one vendor where we're not doing it in a public way.
It depends on how substantial the changes are.
Okay. Can you tell me the micromobility personal use in Virginia slide? It's, is it 5 of 18? Do all of these rules apply to the shared environment?
They do, yes. As I read the statute, they do.
So you can, according to this, they can only be used on streets where the speed limit is 25 miles per hour or less.
That's correct.
I think one of the things we need to address in the policy is where they can be driven. I'm certainly open to having a discussion. I'm not a big fan right now, somebody can convince me otherwise, of seeing e-scooters on the sidewalks. I just think I think people have an expectation when they're walking on the sidewalk that there's a certain degree of exposure to vehicles, and these are vehicles. Even though we consider them as pedestrians when they're on the sidewalk, that doesn't make any sense to me.
But we allow bicycles on the sidewalk now.
But I don't like them there either.
I don't know.
So I mean, it's like, you got to look holistically. And if you don't allow them, you're not going to have connectivity, because you've got roads that are 30 miles an hour and nobody's going to be able to go down Traburn.
Well, according to this, you can't use them.
You
could
would
on
go
the
to the sidewalk. If you want to go down Traburn, you would have to use the sidewalk.
And not the street.
So you
So,
would be
is
banning.
that what that means, only on, with 25 miles per hour or less?
These are the rules about operating them on roads.
Okay.
Not about operating them on sidewalks.
Yeah,
And I think too, one of the things that, I don't have a strong feeling either way on sidewalks or not, but I do acknowledge that we have parts of the city that we don't have a well-divided or dedicated bike lane. And I would rather the scooter be on the sidewalk than be in the travel lane with vehicles. But that's just my opinion.
But
And I
when
think we
there
have-
is a bike lane, I think there should be education and encouragement to use a scooter and a bicycle in those bike lanes and not on the sidewalk.
And I think the one place where that definitely wouldn't work is on campus, because there's so many places you can't get to if you're not riding on some sidewalk. But that's a different environment than it is for.
It's also not subject to the city code.
Right. And they would need to come up with, the university would need to come up with their own guidelines on how to use it.
And they are.
Right.
The liability issues for the city are different with operating these on sidewalks.
Which creates greater exposure.
As there are also Americans with Disabilities Act issues that have been coming up, so the legal challenges to these have been moving, just like these have, from west to east. And so when these things get left on the sidewalk, or when they get left in a curb cut or a ramp, you have problems with people who have mobility challenges of their own, who are blocked from access to places where they should be. So those are issues that have to be taken into account. So it may be that you can devise areas of the city where they're appropriate on sidewalks, but there are certainly areas of the city where they would not be.
Right.
Yeah, so, and I kind of brought up sidewalk or no sidewalk. I do see that there are some places in the city where being on the road is dangerous for somebody on a scooter. Just as you head east on Richmond Road up by the College Corner there.
Sorority houses
Yeah,
area.
the sidewalk is probably not conducive for a scooter there, so, but there really isn't a whole lot of lane left, because there's no bike lane there in front of the president's house, for example. So it's going to be a little challenging in that area. So to ban them from all sidewalks, I think, is a challenge
I think
for me.
from the limited perspective that I've seen couples, whether they're students or young professionals, utilize these e-scooters. They've been using the bike lanes on Richmond Road, which just goes to Richmond Road or the roads that have bike lanes. But I think that's a data point that we have to capture when we review this pilot program once it ends.
Yeah, and I think Mr. Maslin's point is a good one, that, as we think about what we're going to do, we need to think about the user case. But I think we also, as we go through the first year of the pilot program with the vendor, we look at actual usage. And that'll give us some really good insight on where they're being used the most and how.
Will we have an opportunity to see what the college's proposed recommendations may be at some point? Do you have any idea what their timeline might be?
I think they're moving fairly quickly. They have not gotten anything concrete. They sent me some slides on sort of basic parameters, but that's it.
Or PowerPoint
But
slides?
I do think we'll have the opportunity to see some of the information. We could even invite them to come and talk to us next Thursday if you'd like. I don't know if they can on the short notice. Got a full agenda.
Sometime in the future.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just so long as there's collaboration, I think.
Sure. The president has said to us that she very much wants there to be collaboration, and even going as far as perhaps joint procurement of the vendor, which would be great, because then, you've got the simplicity of one app, one vendor to deal with that every user is interacting with.
Great.
Anything else? You have enough guidance?
I think so. I mean, over the next few weeks, we'll be putting this into a pilot program format. So it won't be part of the ordinance, but it'll just be sort of a standalone pilot program document. And we'll bring that back to you in December. And as we put it together, there may be some things that we need to come to you to get clarification on, and we'll do that.
Okay, great. Thank you. So the next item on the agenda is the FY 2021 proposed budget calendar. Ms. Dameron, is this your presentation?
Good afternoon, and in your packet there's the FY21 budget calendar. There are a lot of dates on here. The majority of them are either internal for the staff or agree or coordinate with the date of your meetings. There are about 3, though, I'd like to point out for your consideration, and that is on February 1st, that's a Saturday, the City Council retreat. There's also a optional work session scheduled on March 18th. Typically at the work session on the 9th, we have outside agencies, but we like to reserve that extra day in case it's a full agenda and we need to push to an extra meeting. And then those are the ones that don't coincide with your regular scheduled meetings. What we'd like is if you have a conflict with that to let us know so we can adjust accordingly early on. Certainly, if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer those.
March 18th is a Wednesday, and do we have a time?
On March 18th, we would start at our normal time, which would be 4 o'clock, would be my assumption.
I don't have any questions.
Thank you.
And is it possible or have meeting requests gone out for these? Because I don't recall us talking about dates yet for retreat, who's available,
No,
travel
we've not done
plans.
that. That's part of this process, is presenting to you what we think the calendar could be, and then we'll adjust it as we need to.
Can someone, Ms. Felico or somebody, send out a consolidated list of these are the things you explicitly must be available for? Please let us know if there's a conflict and then we can get back.
We wanted to start early so that we had a date.
Does that work?
It works. Yeah, thank you.
I just had one suggestion, maybe on June 12th, put in parentheses, if needed,
We did that
after that one.
Sure.
on the online version.
On the online version.
Oh, okay, absolutely.
Good.
I'll make that adjustment.
Anything else? None? Okay, thank you. This is a really important part of what we do, this budget process. And it is interesting how comparatively little participation we often get in our discussions on how we're going to spend the citizens' money. And so we encourage people to pay attention, stay involved, and let us know your thoughts, as many of you are eager to do. On other matters, this takes us to City Council communications. Anybody want to report from any of their liaison assignments?
Yeah, just real quick, Tourism Council, Ms. Semino has hired 2 strategic positions. She's filled the CFO position, and then the marketing directors is probably not the right term. I forgot David's last name, the CFO, but he's joined us from Adamark, and then Julie O'Neill is the new marketing director, and she's formerly with Busch Gardens. So making great progress there.
Just want to report, this is not necessarily from the board of directors of the business council, but it's related business council. Andrew Trivet, Michelle DeWitt, and Chief Dunn were awarded as 15 under 50, and congratulations to y'all.
Well, and also Laura Overy.
Laura Overy, who's not here.
And Adria as a member of the EDA.
Bill Denton.
Oh, and I was just going to say that I haven't had, but tomorrow there is an EDA meeting, and tomorrow afternoon, and then we also have a school board liaison committee meeting as well. And I personally am going to the National League of Cities annual conference in San Antonio, Texas, next week.
Oh, my.
Yeah, we'll see what all I learn and bring back.
Earlier today, Vice Mayor Pons and I had the privilege of attending the 10th anniversary or 120th Business Roundtable EDA luncheon, and there we were greeted by a special speaker, our new fire chief, Chief Eagle. Chief, do you want to just mind coming just to say hello? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I think I just did.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be part of the Williamsburg community, and I now have uniforms, and I'm official, and I'm still learning my way around, but fitting in very nicely, and proud to be part of the Williamsburg Fire Department and part of this team here. So you guys got a great city team, and I appreciate y'all's support of the city, and I'm proud to be part of it.
Well, on behalf of the community, we'd just like to extend a welcome to you and your family.
One thing, could you, Chief, could you explain how you had a connection with Williamsburg when Chief Dent and his new fire station team went out looking at fire stations?
Sure. About, I think it was 2017, a team from Williamsburg came down to a brand-new station that we built in Danville with Chief Dent, and several of our current members came down and did a tour and looked at some of the pros and cons and things that we did, and had a great visit with them. So I've known Chief Dent for many years, not only from that, but from working with on committees statewide and different things like that. So I had some connection here, but it's good to be part of the team.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You did. I think you said no. Schedule of meetings, anything you want to highlight besides the budget process?
Ms. Ramsey had already mentioned the EDA meeting on November the 13th. Of course, we have our city council meeting on the 14th, and then, not too early to say that the city offices will be closed for Thanksgiving.
And I believe we have a very exciting audit committee meeting on Thursday morning. We're very much looking forward to that, Mr. This takes us to open forum. Anybody who'd like to address council on any matter, we encourage you to come forward. If you'd be kind enough to state your name and address and keep your remarks to 5 minutes or less, we'd appreciate that. Seeing no one, close the open forum. I want to come to council and ask a question. We are scheduled to go into closed session, but we also have the Housing Authority meeting, and we have some folks who've been very patiently waiting here for the last hour. Would it be possible to take a recess, open up as the Housing Authority, conclude that, and then go into closed session afterwards?
Yes, of course.
We need a motion to do that?
Yes.
I move that city council go into recess.
Second.
Ms. Felico?
Mr. Maslin?
Aye.
Ms. Ramsey?
Aye.
Mayor Fryling?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Pons?
Aye.
Mr. Zhang?
Aye.
We will take a 5-minute break and then reconvene as the Williamsburg Redevelopment and Housing Authority.